Greetings and welcome to Real Politik. I'm James Tracy, your host. Our guest today is Adnan Zuberi. He is the director and producer of the 2013 documentary 9/11 in the Academic Community. The film examines the question of why 9/11 is such a taboo topic among those of us in the university environment. Adnan Zuberi accomplishes this by interviewing several senior professors willing to go on the record and discuss the most momentous event in recent world history. The film is well worth our attention. In 2013, it was awarded for Documentary Achievement at the University of Toronto Film Festival. It's been endorsed by the presidents of the State University of New York and McMaster and Ryerson Universities in Canada, and the former co-director of NATO's Catastrophic Terrorism Research Unit. As Professor Lance DeHaven Smith notes, this documentary confronts the Academy's uncritical response to the defining event of our times. It is an essential viewing for everyone in academe. Of course, Lance DeHaven Smith, the author of Conspiracy Theory in America. He's political science professor at FSU, among other titles. More information on Adnan Zuberi's film is available at 911inacademia.com. Hi, Adnan. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Professor Tracy, for inviting me on your show.
Well, it's wonderful to have you here on the program. I've been wanting to be able to interview you for some time. I wanted to begin just with a general question, and that is, how did you initially become interested in the complexities of 9/11 and the War on Terror?
Sure. It all began when I was quite young, when I was in about grade 10, when I was in high school. And my brother showed me some material that I would say comes under the category of what I now call critical perspectives on 9/11 and the origins of the War on Terror. I was quite young back then, and so I didn't understand very much. It generally seemed to me at that young age that things deserved some greater inquiry, but let's face it, I was in grade 10. Then later on, when I was in university, I came across a greater variety of literature on the subject, thanks to the internet, and I hope to discuss internet solutions later on in the interview when we discuss what we can do in the future with regards to topics like these. Anyways, when I was in my senior undergraduate years, in my third and fourth year, I felt that I had made some very detailed observations of how professors are. I went into university, into the honors theoretical physics program at the University of Waterloo. I had the Einstein complex inside me. I wanted to figure out the entire universe. I had this deep craving for, the universe's mysteries and this and that. I always wanted to know the big answers. And I saw my professors as, kind of like academic gods. And I looked up to them very much and basically took as a truth whatever they'd say. But I began to critically analyze, I think, many types of interactions and behaviors that told me that there are deeper phenomena that basically govern the reaction of highly educated people. And when it came to discussing some literature, I'm talking about peer-reviewed literature in academic journals that were critical of the origins of the War on Terror, I saw some very unusual behaviorisms, and it really breaks apart one's views of the godliness of these professors. Though I must say they are very good personalities, and you and I. You work with them every day, and sure, they may disagree with us on a whole bunch of topics, but they are good personalities. But when it comes to some very important subjects or sensitive topics, this idea that knowledge is power that I was raised with, yes, I worked in high school. Later on, you begin to realize that it can be the other way around. Power shapes knowledge, shapes language, shapes terminology, orients our thinking, and so I hope we'll have a chance to discuss Charles Lindbloom, the famous political scientist at Yale University, as he discusses those things with very precise detail. And that's where my journey began, in terms of saying to myself, wow, this is extremely important stuff. This notion that academia is extremely objective. They have figured it all out. They understand the war on terror and all that. I basically found out that there's a huge psychological component to it that needs to be documented as to how academics treat their own colleagues when it comes to raising logical questions about certain types of narratives. Mm-hmm. And so I documented that, and the documentary has been very successful, I'm happy to say, and continues to be. Mm-hmm. And hopefully we'll have time to discuss that as well.
Well, your experience is not surprising. At the same time, knowledge production and science and all of these things that we are supposed to do in the academy requires disagreement. So there should be nothing that is left off the table. There should be nothing that is taboo. Are there any particular experiences that you can relate? You've done this in a general sort of way, but more specifically with regard to maybe a particular class or a particular article or book that might have been brought up in the presence of an academic, and there was a response that suggested that, well, we're not going to go there.
When it comes to direct experiences with colleagues or with professors, where basically you sense what we're calling here a taboo, that's what it is. In terms of direct experiences, yes, I've had colleagues. To this day, I'm best of friends with, mm-hmm. And when it comes to discussing sensitive topics, there's a variety of responses I've received. Sometimes there's a non-response. I have one colleague at Oxford University, finishing up his particle physics doctorate, who I had the pleasure of living with for several years during our undergrad. And I remember showing him Building 7. And just moments before showing him that, I was talking to him about, as physicists, we're talking about the conservation of momentum, conservation of energy, basic Newtonian mechanics, how buildings with a, safety factor of 5, structurally reinforced steel, all that stuff, 3/4 of the size of a football field, it doesn't just come down in free fall. And yes, there's some general agreement, as long as you don't mention, like, let's say Building 7. If you're talking about general, let's say, structural mechanics, it's an obvious thing to say, of course, things don't come down in free fall. As soon as you put in a certain word like Building 7, and it has some type of connection to a sensitive moment in our history, and I showed him the video, as he's eating his apple, he looks at it, he sees 2 repetitions of the video, and walked away. There was no response. He walked away. Another colleague of mine, I still talk to him about that experience. He's a good friend of mine. We were all in the same theoretical physics program, and he remembers that experience. He was there with me. And so I just never thought one could just walk away like that, but it happened. And I never brought that experience back up with that particular colleague. Again, he's still my friend to this day, a very good friend of mine. But it's something that just doesn't fit the decorum, perhaps you would call it. So that's one of many experiences. Another experience that is one that led to the documentary was I went into to visit the undergraduate assistant chair of civil engineering at the University of Waterloo. And I asked him, I told him that I'm doing an informal project on gravitational progressive collapse of high-rise structures. I'm concerned about their safety and so forth, and was wondering if there are experts around. And so he asked me to show him some more work as to what I was doing. And so I showed him, again, Building 7. And he looked at it and he said, what is there to research about this? That, yeah, it came down in a coordinated, controlled way. And I said, then I explained to him what that building was. I never named it before when I just showed him the video.
Uh-huh.
And again, this is what I'm saying about how power shapes knowledge. Of course, you know that because you know far more than I do as being a professor of media studies and analysis. And I feel it should be the other way around, where I should be interviewing you to describe the details of media analysis to me. But at least with regards to that experience, when I told him about this building and how it's somewhat under dispute, and came down on that day, and a majority of the civil engineering community does not know about it, even though they should be experts on building safety. Here's a huge anomaly, if that's what it is in their professional language. It deserves some attention, but I didn't go into the politics of it. I just kind of just said it came down on September 11th. And they say some hypotheses are that it came down due to fire. This is what I saw that happened. And this is when it kind of hit me hard. He rolled back. He was on his chair, rolled back, put his hands up, and basically looked away. The eye connection, the eye contact disconnected. And for 20 seconds, we had an unusual moment of silence. I was like a frozen vegetable. I've never seen that type of behavior. And he said to himself, he's like, no, I'm not. No, I'm not. I don't want to. And I'm like wondering, what am I to do in this situation? My goodness.
Now, let me clarify. You're an undergraduate, correct? And you're going to one of your professors with this video footage.
That's right. People who are experts in building safety. But once again, we're talking about how politics can trump scientific objectivity. So I had direct experience with this, and then he cooled down, and I just said to him, I'm just looking for a professor who may be able to guide me on the right track here. And so he kind of cooled down, thankfully, and he basically took a piece of paper and just wrote down one person's name for me to talk to, and that was it. But that was the behavior, and that's what the mainstream media, that's what journalists, they don't get to see that. That's not something that you can document on video exactly. Mm-hmm. That's not, sorry, I'll end there. Yeah.
No, that's all very helpful information. And yet this was long before you began to approach academics who might be interviewees for the film, correct?
That's right. There's, not a chance that those professors I spoke to. By the way, I did speak to about 25 to 30 professors. One time I counted it up. I went with a PhD candidate, a colleague of mine at the time, to go visit many of these professors. We went to professors in different departments, by the way, not just engineering. We spoke to so many of them. It was about three of them that shared concerns. The rest of them, they were very unusual behaviors. And so I came to understand that I became critical of my own approach, if I was to learn anything, and I learned that my own approach was wrong, that I need to understand what it means to engage with the taboo of our times. This is something it is something extraordinary, and I think the activist community, and I believe that maybe the majority of your listeners here, I would like to be critical, but in a good way, where I would like to suggest there are some ways to make progress within this narrow channel of the taboo in terms of our communication format.
Mm-hmm. You said there were over 25 to 30 professors that you approached, and I think that you have about 8 or 9 professors that you ended up actually interviewing for the documentary. And for those of you who have not seen the documentary, let me run down the list. Richard B. Lee, Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at University of Toronto. Walter G. Pitman served as Dean of Arts and Science at Trent University. John McMurtry, Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at University of Guelph. David McGregor, Professor of Sociology and former Chair of Soc at King's College of the University of Western Ontario. Omar Ramahi, Professor of Electrical Computer Engineering at the University of Waterloo. Lynn Margulis, Distinguished University Professor in Geosciences at UMass. Paul Zaremka, Professor of Economics at SUNY at Buffalo. Robert Corral, Professor Emeritus of Civil Engineering at McMaster. Michael Trusello, assistant professor of English and General Ed at Mount Royal, and Graeme MacQueen, retired professor of religious studies at McMaster University, founding director of McMaster Center for Peace Studies. Most of the academics that you approached were Canadian.
That's right. Most of those academics are Canadian, and that's mostly due to a limited budget. I was an undergrad, but within a very small amount of money, I was happy with the production that we pulled off. It's now, those academics that you described, they are some very major academics in Canada. And I would say in some parts of the world, they're recognized internationally, many of them. Yeah. Richard B. Lee, for example, he is a part of the National Academy of Sciences, the U.S. National Academy of Sciences, even though he's a Canadian. And, two of the interviewees, John McMurtry and Richard B. Lee, they're both fellows of the Royal Society of Canada. In the U.S., that's the equivalent of, let's say, the National Academy of Sciences. These people are people of world distinction to be elected to those things. And Walter Pitman was the president emeritus of Ryerson University. He is the president emeritus. So we had and then we also had many presidential people endorsing the film, and I'm happy to say the film is in curriculum at quite a few universities, at all the major universities in Ontario, and a couple universities in the U.S. as well. There are some universities that I never even knew about that my film's being taught in. I find out like randomly. There's this one San Francisco Teachers College that's teaching it. I'm like, okay, thank you. So that's nice to hear.
John McMurtry, for example, was a very early critic or skeptic of 9/11, and he was treated very badly by his colleagues. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think that was a very major example that I put in the documentary to allow people to understand how the Academy works when it comes to reactions to very sensitive topics, and 9/11 being the case study that I probed in the documentary.
In fact, some of his colleagues actually were going to, or apparently did, report him to the CIA or FBI because of his views.
It's extraordinary. John McMurtry, being a philosopher of international distinction, an ethical philosopher, he examined the official story of 9/11 and found that obviously didn't really meet the scholarly criteria. And he's a person of academic stature, a certain academic stature to certainly raise many questions. And I was amazed that his colleagues, academic colleagues at Harvard University, of Harvard fame, husband and wife, both said to him that they are reporting him to the FBI and the CIA. When I read that, I felt that this is something that if the larger academic community, if this is communicated to them in the right way, they will begin to understand how many mainstream academics can be, I'm sorry to say, quite irrational in their reaction. What we have come to understand is that there are two approaches, two conventional approaches when it comes to academia. There's some overlapping characteristics of approaches in the general public as well, and I'll try to discuss their deficiencies to be critical of our own approaches as well and discuss solutions. So John McMurtry is the type of fellow who will speak out loud. If there's something wrong, he holds the honor of usually speaking out loud. Even when it came to the invasion of Iraq, he was on air on mainstream television debating a person representing the Bush administration, and I think he did an extraordinary job. So McMurtry speaks out loud, and many people, when you feel there's something wrong, you speak out loud. If you do that when it comes to, let's say, the origins of the War on Terror or 9/11, you will be disciplined. So that approach hasn't exactly worked out very well. The equivalence counter support structures or support mechanisms aren't exactly there to help faculty in that case. You would probably know just as well as McMurtry, given your direct experiences. And then the second approach is, well, maybe I'm not going to speak out loud. Maybe I'm going to pursue the scholarly way, which is to sit down, gather my facts and research, and pursue the peer-reviewed journals, right? And so academics also did that as well. And there's now over almost 25 or 30. It's all on the 911academia.com website, the peer-reviewed papers. I'm not talking about the Journal of 9/11 Studies. I'm talking about actual, let's say, mainstream journals. And the papers are there. I'll give you an example of a very major publication. It's by Peter Dale Scott, University of California at Berkeley professor, who wrote the book called The Road to 9/11.
Sure,
And it was published by the University of California Press. So here we have a major press. The book was also endorsed by a former national security advisor and by many other people, including a 5-star general in France, a former. And so anyways, so you have a lot of credibility, major university press, passes the highest levels of peer review.
Sure.
And in one of his chapters, it said, he argued and said that Vice President Cheney, based on what we know from the public documentation, should be investigated as a suspect. I'm talking about word for word here. Should be investigated as a suspect in the events of 9/11. Now, so you pursue the scholarly way, you pursue the peer-reviewed research, and no response.
Okay.
Amazing.
Yeah.
So you speak out, you get in trouble. You publish in the top journal, 0 response. So it's a taboo, and I think it's time to change our communication to some suggestions I'd like to make later on, perhaps.
Well, now, Peter Dale Scott also has credentials in terms of being a former Canadian diplomat and an award-winning poet. Let me suggest here another way of looking at this, of considering this, in that, in certain respects, there is no doubt that Peter Dale Scott's scholarship is impeccable, and that he's been researching deep events since the 1970s or so, right, with the Assassinations compilation, edited volume, I think, from 1976. At the same time, Peter Dale Scott is not in the social sciences, and he's not in political science. Much of what he is doing here is arguably somewhat extracurricular. He's emeritus anyway now. I think he's in his 80s, so he's no longer formally teaching. One could say the same thing, or a very similar thing, with regard to Joan Mellon, who is professor of film studies or literature at Temple University. In fact, she's been on this program in the past. She has researched the JFK assassination and the Garrison investigation extensively, far beyond any academic historian, and yet she is not formally in the department of history or in the history discipline. So in my view, at least in part, these are examples. Now, I'm not taking anything away from your argument that the scholarship of Scott, for example, is flawless or it's very good, very substantial. It is, but they are arguably exceptions that prove the rule.
That's right. I agree with you. Certainly, I agree with you also that it doesn't take away from the argument, but I agree with your observation that it is sometimes a little bit extracurricular, because a person of Scott's caliber and publications, it's surprising he's not in the Department of History and so forth. Although he did tell me, I'm best friends with him and we're in contact every day. He couldn't stand political science, to teach political science or to be in the Department of Political Science, even though he holds his PhD from there at a school, McGill University, where his father was dean of law. But however, I should say that Peter Dale Scott is still highly respected within academic circles. There is sometimes we do think that whenever someone comes into our boat, where they're critical of the war on terror and this and that they have lost some type of perhaps mainstream influence and so forth. Peter Dale Scott is a little bit of an exception to that. He, as I've come to know him really well and respect him very much. And I'm working with him on some very major projects with other, government officials, which is different than this subject matter. But he's highly respected by many distinguished professors in history, in political science, and so forth. And they cite his work. Not in the way that you and I maybe would want in terms of raising critical questions about, let's say, the war on terror, but he's certainly not excluded in many ways. I could go a little bit further by discussing Noam Chomsky and his interaction with Peter Dale Scott. Because I know a lot of people in the activist community have been concerned about Chomsky's response to September 11th.
Well, certainly Noam Chomsky is an extremely, perhaps the most important or influential public intellectual out there, at least in the Western world, I would say, and probably has been for the past 30 or 40 years. And it's a very fascinating case, in particular with regard to 9/11. But Adnan Zuberi, I want you to please hold that thought. We're coming up on a break now. We're speaking with Adnan Zuberi, who is the director and producer of the 2013 documentary 9/11 in the Academic Community. And this is Real Politik. I'm James Tracy here on Truth Frequency Radio, truthfrequencyradio.com. We'll have more in a moment. Greetings, this is James Tracy here on Real Politik, Truth Frequency Radio, truthfrequencyradio.com. We're speaking with Adnan Zuberi. He's the director and producer of the 2013 documentary 9/11 in the Academic Community. And Adnan, we were bringing up Peter Dale Scott and talking about, for example, Noam Chomsky, and you had mentioned the fact that they at one or more times squared off concerning 9/11.
That's right. Peter Dale Scott and Chomsky, they're still friends, and they generally respect each other's work in various ways. When it comes to a more detailed examination of political phenomena that happens once in a while, events that change the course of our history and so forth, whether it's JFK or 9/11, yes, they did have major disagreements. And when it comes to Chomsky, his left-wing model, let me be kind of brief here, and I hope I don't oversimplify it. Peter Dale Scott did find the general left-wing model to be quite superficial that Chomsky subscribes to. It's kind of like a two-layered system. You have the oppressors at the top, and you have the oppressed at the bottom. The system is rational. It knows what it's doing. The people at the top know what they're doing, and so forth. And when it comes to Peter Dale Scott, he actually finds that, no, the system is profoundly irrational. Actually, within this so-called ruling class and so forth, there are competing factions. And this helped my understanding of political science substantially. And yes, every analysis certainly ought to be improved as more knowledge becomes available. And certainly Scott's analysis can be subject to improvement as well. Nothing is perfect. Mm-hmm. However, I do find it to be far more realistic, at least, than the general left-wing model. And within these competing factions, Scott gives numerous examples of how one faction of the government is eroding the powers of another faction in the government without it even knowing. Mm-hmm. That's extraordinary. You would have, let's say, the continuity of government operation, which is the most sensitive of all government projects. It has to do with the so-called Doomsday Project, which began from the possibility of a nuclear war with Russia. It's funny. We're in a Cold War with Russia once again, mm-hmm. Thanks to Washington and company. Right. Anyways, there's much more to discuss that, but basically. The continuity of government operations, there was a senior congressman who asked to review or asked about oversight into this thing. And he said he was given a no. And it was amazing. He was given a no, and it's because he did not have the right amount of national security clearance. And basically there's no oversight, as far as we know, when it comes to public documentation. And it was in the continuity of government project was actually overriding some other laws as well, just by claiming supreme authority. And so Scott is trying to bring to the attention of many left-wing scholars that you need a deeper analysis. You need to do character analysis here. They look at things through a broader, general through structures, like a structural approach. but they're not interested in like characters, let's say committing a bank robbery or getting specific. But that's the type of analysis we need if we're going to make progress. So what's going wrong with our world?
Well, I think that Scott has also taken some issue with Lance DeHaven Smith's state crimes against democracy model, in terms of it perhaps being somewhat simplistic. The notion of democracy is something that itself can be interpreted in a variety of ways.
I know that Scott has praised and critiqued Lance DeHaven Smith's work. DeHaven Smith has been very successful with his publications, and Scott very much acknowledges that that DeHaven Smith has been actually able to get his work somewhat into curriculum, and to, especially state crimes against democracy. Mm-hmm. It's gained a far wider readership than, I think, let's say, Scott's more specific books towards on deep politics. So he does praise that. When it comes to critique, yes, the term state crimes against democracy, as if it's the entire state. Scott, given his work on deep politics, feels that we need to focus on certain factions of the government. It's not the entire government that is wrong here or complicit to the same extent. He actually shows examples how certain parts of the government don't even know about what's going on in other parts of the government, and so I can understand where both of them are coming from, and perhaps some middle ground approach would be correct. Realistically, I think it really just has to do with sometimes people may not have the time to read, as I once did, Scott's work in such detail, and I think that's all it is. I think Lance DeHaven's work, DeHaven Smith's work, can be improved to be a little bit more specific in that regard.
Let's return to your film for a moment, if possible. I wanted to ask you how you went about assembling the list of prospective interviewees, because a great many of them are actually scientists. They're not in the humanities as much so, or in the social sciences, but many of them are in the hard sciences.
We had, when it comes to the hard sciences, we had one structural engineer, and many of them are actually in the humanities and social sciences. I think you may have been referring perhaps to another documentary by, I think, Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. But at least my documentary, most of the people there, with the exception of Robert Kroll, Omar Ramahi, or Lynn Margulis, most of them are actually in the humanities and social sciences. But with regards to your question, how the film was framed, this is very important. When I was first making the film, I was in the mindset of the general activist, where you discuss hard evidence. This is something that's really important for, I believe, activists to contemplate on. When it comes to discussing with academia, I believe we have to let go of that old approach. Hard evidence. I came to understand that the more hard evidence you discuss, and I had direct experiences, as I was saying, I was talking about Building 7 with civil engineering professors, it doesn't work. Academia, there's a very specific subculture that the activist community does not understand. They speak in different ways, whereas sometimes we look at a very flashy, let's say, book cover, they tend towards a boring-looking book cover. There's a different style of things, there's a different subculture that the academic community has, and I think that when I understood that, I basically rewrote the entire documentary, and so I had to look at certain case studies as to how academia has treated critical perspectives on 9/11. I can go into that. I might get a little academic, but let me talk about a more general approach that will help your listeners here in terms of their future approaches. One should not, I feel, when it comes to a taboo topic of this nature, go right towards hard evidence. It can repel people right away. You can have the best evidence in the world, it's not going to get any attention. Okay, same applies to JFK. If we've learned anything from deep political events, hard evidence sometimes does not work. Is there another approach? And I've showed that it's not that I exactly use soft evidence, though some may critique it that way, and I'm okay with that. But when you look at, let's say, torture testimony, And the crux of the 9/11 Commission report, is chapters 5 and 7, which deal with the alleged Al-Qaeda plot of the event of 9/11. Much of them rely on torture testimony. It's amazing how much they rely on it. Mm-hmm. And the person they tortured retracts his testimony. I tried to basically frame that by saying, when it comes to academia, what does it mean to base an entire story on a testimony that is retracted later on? A person is brutally tortured and so forth. Is that scholarship? Because if it is, then we have major implications for what will constitute scholarship then. Can you imagine, Jim, doing a PhD defense, and in the middle of it, the referees ask, "So, where'd you get this fabulous information from?" And you say, "Well, I got it from torture testimony." And then you're like, "Well, the person kind of retracted it later on, and we've waterboarded them 183 times in 1 month." It's certainly gonna. What would probably happen is that the referees would probably call some type of ethics committee and the police on you if that was the case. Okay, but when it comes to power, when it comes to people up high, it's okay. And I want to communicate things at that epistemological level in the right tone, and I wanted to gradually develop the story. I didn't want to get right into it. The Oxford filmmaking manual, I read it. They say, ask your big questions right away, and this and that, and get right to the big stuff. And they made a whole bunch of recommendations. Don't have talking heads. About all of the standard procedures of documentary making. This is a taboo subject. It needs to be communicated far more carefully. And when I took that into consideration, academics, this is not a film to be watched publicly. This is a film to be watched privately in, sadly to say, the comfort of an academic's own living room. And I receive emails almost every other day from professor, the title of distinguished professor, this and that, saying that it's an extraordinary film. I've had whereas most activists, I think, and I once I've experienced these times as well. You go through arguments with people, your friendships break up, and so forth. Over the last 2 years since the documentary, I have not had a single debate with anyone. I've just had over 60, 70 academics emailing me with full support and wanting to work together. One of the heads of the Royal Society of Canada, actually, right now, invited me in March to discuss the film and for project collaboration. So that's as high as it gets. So I hope the activist community can learn from this new style of communication.
That's great to hear. Were there academics that turned you down for an interview as well?
When it comes to academics turning me down, no. I mostly approached academics that I knew would be open to discussing this. I can tell you why. I'm okay with people critiquing me with my approach. In terms of, did I ask the other side to present their story and so forth? The thing is that, as the documentary shows, most professors actually really don't even know about what critical perspectives on 9/11 are. So you can't get specific with them. And so I didn't bother asking many of them. When it came to just not getting responses, it was just later on they may have said, "Oh, sorry, I missed your email. I would have been up for it," but that's about it. But I selected very particular academics that I knew would be just right for the type of message that I wanted to convey. There are many other professors that I appreciate their publications when it comes to 9/11, but I was trying to achieve a very certain type of austere aesthetic with this film and the type of personalities in it. Mm-hmm. So I was very particular in that sense.
There are a number of U.S. scholars who have been highly critical of 9/11 and who have been involved in looking at 9/11 and other deep events, and they've been left out of your panel of interviewees, of those who you consulted. I think in part you've already alluded to this earlier on, and that is simply that you were working within budget constraints that disallowed some people to be included.
That's right. That's probably the main reason. With the reason I just mentioned a couple seconds ago about being very particular, I did feel that when you have too many academics, it's very difficult. You do kind of lose focus. I felt that in Ontario, in the province of Ontario here in Canada, I was blessed with, within a 2-hour or 3-hour radius, having all these personalities, and I felt they were exactly the right personalities. And when it comes to, let's say, discussing David A. Griffin, who would be an example of a person of the question you asked, yes, he is the most well-known professor when it comes to a critical examination of the events of September 11th, but he and I do differ in approach, though we have a lot of respect for each other. He feels that we should go through the hard evidence way. I'm not against hard evidence. I think a lot of activists misunderstand this point. I've shown basically that if you want to go through hard evidence, I'll give you an example of a colossal communication failure. Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, they made a documentary called Experts Speak Out. Now, I personally have respect for that documentary, but when it comes to academia, you wonder why there's maybe 1 or 0, as far as I counted a couple of months ago, professors of structural engineering that have signed on. Okay? Now, why is it that there are over 2,000 professional architects or retired architects and engineers that have signed on, and there's 0 structural academic engineers? That's what happens when it comes to hard evidence. You have to be very careful with how you communicate hard evidence. You can have the best evidence in the world, and you'll be wasting many years of your life in your activist life. We have to spend more time learning how to communicate stuff. Otherwise, we'll just be. And so, you can go back to the 1960s. There were probably activists that were very concerned about the events that happened with regards to JFK, and they wrote letters to, let's say, professors at Harvard and never heard back. When you get a letter from an activist and you're, let's say, in some position of authority, talking about some very sensitive national security type information, people are not going to respond back. And so we have to be very delicate in our communication. We can't, and I think that it's not just a technique. It's actually, I feel, the right way to actually talk as human beings when it comes to sensitive topics. And I think that's it's a genuine factor. I think that is a reason why professors are trusting of my communication with them, and they continue to respond and be quite invitational.
Looking at the roster of the interviewees, the people that were included in your film, yes, you're correct. I think about a third of them are in the hard sciences, engineering, and so on and so forth. So I do stand corrected in that regard. And I think that also is one of the things that does make your film really quite unique, in that you have these individuals who are more so from the social sciences, the humanities, who are looking at this, who are looking at 9/11 apart from, say, architects and engineers, because they do take up that particular area or approach. And yet there's so much more to this event in terms of the media, in terms of communication and culture and the like. After all, these are the ways in which we formulate our own attitudes and our own worldviews, and why so many people are, become ambivalent about 9/11 and discussing it.
Yeah, that's right. I think with regards to, we did have a majority of professors that are in the social sciences, and I did want to make one more remark when it comes to video production and sequencing. It's very easy to make to bring a set of footage together to make it look like a conspiracy documentary. I was well aware of this. I had a lot of footage, and you can make this film look like a conspiracy film. But it had to be, authored in a very particular way. When it comes to, and I think, when it comes to, your question, and let me tie it in here, with something, that the film started off with to give the right tone. It's what Professor David McGregor said in light of Peter Dale Scott's research. And this may touch upon your question. And when it comes to, he says, my friend Peter Dale Scott talks about deep events. events which we don't spend too much time trying to understand, events which, in a sense, we try not to understand, events which make a huge impact on the way we live, but we stop thinking about them almost as soon as they happen. And I think that's the very gradual, steady approach in how we communicate in a very reflective way, and that's how we achieve the attention of serious scholars. And I think when it comes to the social sciences and so forth that you discussed, it was that presentation, that style of presentation, that I think can make progress in these disciplines with that type of approach. I'm not sure if I answered your question. I wasn't able to hear it entirely.
I think it was more of an observation than a question, really, but I did wanted to correct the record there. Mm-hmm. You brought up earlier in our discussion Yale political scientist Charles Lindbloom. You want to discuss him for a bit, and then before we conclude the program, of course, we do want to talk a bit about solutions.
That's right. I'd be happy to talk about Lindbloom and solutions. When it comes to Yale University, there was an eminent political scientist that taught there, who now holds a position of distinguished professor emeritus of political science at Yale. His name's Charles E. Lindbloom again. And he wrote a book called Inquiry and Change, the troubled attempt to change and understand society. And he basically looks back at the deeper phenomena as to why people are the way they are when it comes to discussing political phenomena and so forth. And I think we could say, and he discusses this as well, we could say that a lot of professors of political science are indoctrinated, but I think there's a more subtle phenomena, there's a broader phenomena that Lindbloom discusses, and it's called impairment. Impairments in professional inquiry. He also examined impairments in lay inquiry as well. And it's a very lengthy subject, so allow me to try to be very concise by referring to an atomic scientist who was practicing in North America, I believe, who made the following observation that summarizes his understanding of impairments. This atomic scientist said, Americans are free to say what they believe. Americans are free to say what they think, but they do not think what they are not free to say. And I think that was an extraordinary quote. I had to read it a couple of times to fully understand its significance. And it's right. There are certain types of impairments. We just, yes, we're free to openly criticize and question things and this and that. But the very thought of questioning certain things, the thought itself does not actually even arise. And he's talking about how these impairments are induced from various factors when it comes to, let's say, various power structures and influences from the elite. His basic conclusion was we need an equal competition of ideas. Lindbloom was very happy to receive my documentary, and when I have his review in full, I'll make that public. And did you want me to also discuss solutions right from here, or did you want to lead it somewhere?
I think we've already broached that, but we can certainly develop that further in that you were talking about, I think part of the solution is what you've already suggested in terms of your documentary, in terms of approaching it, and in terms of assembling it, not just making another quote-unquote conspiracy theory film or documentary or the equivalent. Not that there isn't a place for those somewhere, but you're looking at different subject matter here, different interviewees, and there's a certain sort of noble, what have you, nature to this all as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say that when it comes to solutions and presentation, I do feel a bit detached from the larger activist community in that my approach is too specific, too rigid. Highly successful, it never sparks a debate. I've yet to receive any major critique of the film or anyone who disagrees with me in a very major way. I'm talking about academics here. Mm-hmm. There may have been just one person in the general public or two that was critical, and that's okay. But when it comes to academia, the actual target audience, all supportive. So big amount of success, but a very narrow approach that may not be possible for others to duplicate. The basic process here is to write a respectful email that restores trust and so forth to professors about the documentary. That invites the professors because they have credentials that we respect, and ask them not exactly for their feedback or this and that, but just for their consideration if they would like to view this film, and this is who it's been endorsed by and this and that, and it's in curriculum making a difference. And I'd be happy to share that email template. I call it the golden email template. And it works like a charm. I know I could at home I can send 10 emails right now. I'll get like 7 responses saying yes. That's how good it works. So it's a highly private approach, though. I don't publicize professors' names. The ones who have been communicating with me through email saying this is an excellent film. There's a general line of trust there that they're supportive of it, and but it's taboo, and we have to understand the way institutions work. You don't just publicize this like an achievement, saying, "Wow, these 10 professors, are agree with this." It's a private project. When it comes to the nature of this type of taboo, I think we have to make success in a private way, not in public ways. When it comes to academia, in particular, that may deserve another radio show, perhaps, to discuss the private nature of countering taboo subjects, because public approaches don't work. With regards to public approaches for the general public, I do have some good news for your listeners in terms of some good hope for the future. I see the direction of the future of the entire 9/11 research movement as follows, and I may play a very instrumental role in making this happen. In 2011, which was the 10th anniversary of the events of September 11th, Graeme MacQueen, professor here, a very well-known one in the community.
Adnan, we just have about a minute left.
Sure. Basically, we hosted the Toronto hearings. It was a 4-day event at Ryerson University with eminent people, former Supreme Court Italian judge, former U.S. congressmen and senators, this, that. We did a live broadcast. We paid only $1,000 to routers to run our information, basically about the event. We got 12,000 people live watching all at one time, real-time comments and feedback coming in. That it was a costly event. I can now pull that off within less than $500 every single year, grow the live coverage to being far larger, so that's cumulative. And that is the future direction, I think, of the movement. I can't tell you how significant
that's great.
That is.
Adnan Zuberi, I want to thank you very much for appearing on Real Politics.
Thank you for having me on your show.
Adnan Zuberi, more information is available. You can also pick up a copy of the DVD at 911inacademia.com. Until next week, this is James Tracy here on Real Politics, truthfrequencyradio.com. Take care. Bye-bye.